Wonderful, wonderful. It looks like we are live. I want to thank joining us on this for this webinar session run by Civismo, a think tank based out of Madrid in Spain. And obviously, we're delighted to have Nile Gardiner join for sharing your thoughts and your time with us on this discussion, which is going to look at the future shape of Europe-China relations in a post-corona. Nile really needs no intro. Familiar with his work. Nile is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at Heritage. The Heritage Foundation is the conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And really the center that Nile leads is really aptly named because he was himself and foreign policy issues, including the right statecraft strategies for a changing world. Since joining Heritage in 2002, Nile has been a prominent voice and helping American audiences make sense of a number of political dynamics on the other side of the pond, primarily by connecting the democratic aspirations of Brexit voters with the conservative movement in the United States. And I want to remind our audience that Nile is a historian by training. He holds both a bachelor's and an MA in modern history from the University of Oxford, as well as an MA, Master's of Philosophy, and a PhD also in history from Yale University, where he was a Smith Richardson Foundation Fellow and a David Gimbel Fellow. Now, I want to set the tables here for our conversation now by just reminding our audience of a particularly low point and a particularly embarrassing moment for the European Union just last week. Last Friday, the New York Times reported that, in a breaking story, reported that diplomats from the European External Action Service, which is the EU's foreign policy arm, had caved in to literally bullying from Chinese officials from the foreign ministry in Beijing to tone down a report that was meant to expose China's mass disinformation campaign around COVID. You sounded the alarm about the move, just like a number of other officials, Nikki Haley, among others. And I want our audience to know that we didn't title this conversation EU-China relations in a post-COVID world. We titled it Europe-China relations in a post-COVID world, not only because the EU is far from speaking for the European continent as a whole, but also because I would like us to start our conversation by focusing specifically on the UK here for a minute. It's just 2 weeks ago, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who was then deputizing for Prime Minister Johnson as he was recovering from COVID, was cutting a sharply different line from what we saw the EU do just last week. He said there could be no longer business as usual. There couldn't be any longer business as usual with China once the COVID crisis ended. And he urged for a review, a deep dive into how exactly this worldwide pandemic originated back in Wuhan. And he was also joining other leaders, particularly from the Anglosphere, in seeking to hold China accountable for its behavior. So let me ask you now, let's begin it on this front. I don't need to remind anyone that one of Project Fear's main arguments back during the Brexit campaign was that independence from the EU would somehow diminish the voice of the UK on the world stage. And if there's anything that the events of the past 2 weeks have shown, is that independence from the EU is really amplifying and not diminishing the UK's voice on critical issues such as China. So I really want to ask you, Niall, how would you assess the UK-China relationship in the wake of COVID? How different do you think it will be from that the rest of the EU has with China? And how do you think that COVID and Brexit are both going to be changing this relationship?
Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on today's event. Actually, it's great to be here. And you ask some very important questions there. And as you mentioned, I've been a very strong supporter of Brexit. I believe that Brexit is great, not only for the United Kingdom, but I also think it's good for Europe as well, and of course for the US-UK special relationship. And I think that Brexit will result in a stronger Britain on the world stage, a more self-confident, sovereign United Kingdom. And I think you are going to see that expressed certainly as well on the China front. And as Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, said recently, it can no longer be business as usual in terms of dealing with China. And that I think should be a message that is sent not only by the British government, but by every European government as well. I think China's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has been absolutely appalling. And you've seen a huge amount of Chinese disinformation. You've seen no responsibility being expressed whatsoever by the Chinese government for what has happened, even though the reality is that in the early stages of the outbreak in Wuhan, without a doubt, the Chinese government was not acting in a transparent manner and was not cooperating with the rest of the world, was not revealing the true extent of the spread of the virus. I mean, China carries a lot of responsibility for not acting sooner in terms of alerting the world to what was happening. And China also has, over the last few months, adopted a very aggressive disinformation campaign, even blaming the United States and Europe and the West for the spread of the virus. And so we are dealing here in terms of Beijing with a dictatorial regime that spreads a great deal of disinformation, that lies all the time, that is even using COVID-19 as a battering ram against the West. And also the Chinese have been launching a huge propaganda exercise across Europe, which has to be countered here, and we have to hold China to account. And we have to remember that we are dealing with one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. We're not dealing with a free society in any way here. And I think, going back to Dominic Raab's point here, the United Kingdom and Europe must stand up to all forms of Chinese aggression. We cannot let China get away with its own responsibility with regard to its failures over the pandemic. We cannot let the Chinese get away with their completely false claim that the virus started in the West. And we also have to ensure that China does not use the pandemic to get away with further repression of human rights within China, repression of human rights in Hong Kong, or aggressive actions towards Taiwan. On so many fronts, I think China has to be treated as an adversary. It's not a partner for the West. We have to view China in the same way that we view Russia in many respects. This is an increasingly dangerous adversarial power that seeks to undermine the free world. And so I think Raab was absolutely 100% correct in his assertion. I do think the COVID-19 pandemic should be a wake-up call, not only to Europe but to the world, with regard to what we are dealing with in China. And hopefully, we will see in the wake of this pandemic the European powers working more closely together with the United States in confronting the Chinese threat. So we could see that, actually, and we do see, I think, a toughening of the position not only in London but also in Berlin as well, at the heart of the European Union. And many European governments, I think, have been very unhappy with China's handling of the pandemic. And I think even the Spanish government has expressed a great deal of concern. And also, let's not forget, China sent a lot of medical equipment to Europe. Some of it doesn't work at all. And China has been, I think, behaving in a very irresponsible manner and fashion.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you reminding, particularly our audience, particularly of the specific issue of the faulty equipment that has been dispatched to countries across the West. I want to remind our audience that the UK was one of the last cases of such, one of the last victims of such scams. I believe about 2 weeks ago, also the New York Times reported that health authorities in the UK had purchased pinprick, do-it-yourself type of testing kits for COVID, for which they paid 20 million sterling, 20 million pounds. And when they received them, they turned out to be absolutely worthless. And this is just one of the examples. Spain has also been on the losing end of such type of scams. And I really appreciate you reminding that this is more of a holistic propaganda campaign. There are many aspects and many dimensions to this disinformation effort, and also I believe many ironies within it, right? Because on one hand, China keeps disinforming about how it handled the virus in its early days in Wuhan, and keeps also disinforming and blasting other countries' responses, and keeps misinforming the publics of other countries about how their governments are dealing with the crisis. That's on one hand, but on the other hand, some officials within the foreign ministry in Beijing want us to somehow leave politics behind and focus on fighting the virus together. I believe some vice minister at the foreign ministry was recently reported to say that this is somehow a battle between Homo sapiens and the virus. So this is really an irony here between what we're seeing China do in terms of the disinformation front and what they seek to do to kind of cover that up on the other hand. And now I want to turn now specifically, since you mentioned the UK. Well, we were talking about the UK. I want to mention specifically the issue of 5G, because it's an issue you've done a lot of great work on. It is an issue that has major strategic stakes, both obviously for the Chinese Communist Party and for the countries that seem to be trading, giving increased, really spying powers to the Communist Party in exchange for allowing Huawei to play a role in developing 5G networks. And for a while, the UK was seeming to be making just such a strategic mistake, right? And I want to remind our viewers that you had a really interesting piece in the Daily Telegraph back in February, where you spoke of the UK's plans to give Huawei a role in the UK's 5G rollout as Boris's Huawei betrayal. You spoke of it as a grave error of judgment, a slap in the face for Washington, and a major drag in the special relationship as the US and the UK gear up for talks ahead of a US-UK free trade agreement, hopefully in the near future. Naturally, there was stern opposition on the US side, and you pick up on it in your piece. I remember notably that Senator Cotton of Arkansas had a phrase along the lines of London has freed itself from Brussels only to cede sovereignty to Beijing, when he heard of this Huawei case. But the opposition also came from a number of figures within the Tory party, and the government nevertheless won a 24 vote majority in the Commons to approve this plan. But it seems as though now the tide may be turning on this Huawei issue, and I want to ask you, what are the odds of the UK turning its back entirely on Huawei in the wake of COVID? How do you think this 5G issue is going to play strategically in the future, both in terms of the special relationship? Do you think that this, what you called the Huawei betrayal and a slap in the face in Washington, do you think there's any chance that could be reversed? And what would that mean for the UK's relationship with China?
Yeah, that's an extremely important question, and the 5G issue has huge implications for the future of Europe. So it doesn't just impact the United Kingdom, of course; it impacts almost every European country. And China has made deep inroads into the telecommunications infrastructure, not only in the UK but in a large number of European countries over the course of the last 20 years. So China's played, in the UK, for example, a key role in the development of 2G, 3G, 4G. Now Huawei is in a position to play a major role in the development of 5G in the United Kingdom. I think Germany, France, Italy are all in the same position, no doubt Spain as well, potentially. So this is an issue for every European government. I've been very critical of the British government's decision to allow Huawei a 35% stake in the development of 5G in the United Kingdom. And I've warned that this is a huge strategic error of judgment for Great Britain. And the arguments that I've made against Huawei, I think are widely held by many conservative members of Parliament in London who believe that Huawei poses a significant national security threat to the United Kingdom. And if you give Huawei a 35% stake, Huawei, which is basically, to all intents and purposes, a state-owned Chinese entity. It's not an independent company. Huawei is 100% controlled by the Chinese state. And to have a 35% stake in 5G in the UK is absolutely stunningly dangerous. And it's certainly my view that the British government needs to reconsider this. I think the British government is reconsidering the whole 5G situation. The government only narrowly won a vote in early March on its telecommunications infrastructure a bill. There was an amendment put forward by Ian Duncan Smith, who's the former leader of the Conservative Party, urging the government to sunset Huawei's involvement to the end of 2022. And the government suffered a large-scale Conservative rebellion and only narrowly won that vote. Now, there's going to be another vote in the summer, which will focus on telecommunications security. And it's my understanding that the government could easily be defeated, actually, in a House of Commons vote. There are enough Conservative rebels now to defeat the government on this. And it's very significant that if you look at the key, Conservative opponents to the Huawei decision by the government, includes several former members of the cabinet. It includes the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Select Committee, chairman of the 1922 Committee of Backbench MPs, was opposed to in the March vote to the government's position on Huawei. So there's a lot of opposition here, and I do think there's a very strong chance that Boris Johnson is going to reverse course on this. I think that overall, Boris Johnson has been a very strong, effective leader for the United Kingdom. I've disagreed with him on the Huawei approach. I do think, however, that Boris is listening closely to the concerns of many members of his own party. Also, British public opinion is strongly opposed to Huawei. And I think in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, opposition to Huawei is going to grow, not only in the UK, but all over Europe as well. And I think the pandemic really is a wake-up call on the Huawei issue as well. And I have to say that the British government's Huawei decision has been met with huge opposition here in Washington, and the US government and members of Congress have been very strongly opposed to the government's decision. And the US president and his administration have expressed overwhelming opposition. And I think in London they're listening to this. And I think the British government understands that moving forward with Huawei on the 5G front is damaging to the US-UK special relationship. And it is significant that some of the strongest opponents to the UK decision on Huawei have been the strongest supporters of a US-UK free trade deal. Tom Cotton, for example, Marco Rubio, Senator Ted Cruz. These are all key figures who have backed a US-UK trade agreement. And they're leading the opposition in Congress to the Huawei 5G decision in the UK. So, I do think that we can see the British government completely reversing course on this. And hopefully, if the British government does so, then most other European governments will also go down the same path. And in Germany, for example, they're having exactly the same debate. There's very strong opposition within the German parliament, in the Bundestag, to moving forward with Huawei and 5G. And so I'm hopeful that we could see across the board in Europe, European governments saying that they are not going to allow Huawei to play a role in the development of 5G. So hopefully that will be the reality in the coming months, where European governments say enough is enough with regard to China, and they will reverse course on this.
Definitely, and I appreciate you drawing those comparisons, because there's certainly the possibility that the UK here may be kind of maybe giving us a taste of how these debates may unfold in other countries like Germany, like you mentioned, and others who may also be prompted to reassess whether or not they give access away to a state-owned company state-controlled company like Huawei. So those comparisons are certainly very important. And I want to remind our audience that, like you mentioned, one of the key things about this debate, or at least one of the key arguments that the cabinet made when they came out with a plan to give Huawei 35% access to the infrastructure network was, hey, listen, this is a very limited access that we're giving Huawei. We are not giving them access to the sensitive parts of the infrastructure network. But even then, even that limited plan got a lot of backlash, like you said, from key members of the conservative kind of backbench community, and that opposition, like you mentioned, is only going to grow now with COVID. And I appreciate you mentioning those examples. I believe, apart from Ian Duncan Smith and William Hague, also Damian Green, I believe, was also making some really tough statements on how COVID really changes the picture around this 5G issue. I want to turn now, if this is okay, to I want us to take a step out into the European scenario and maybe mention the EU here for a second, because one of the speculations that has circulated following the New York Times' report of the EU caving in to Chinese pressure around the disinformation paper. One of the speculations that has circulated is that EU diplomats were seeking to salvage a round of investment talks, right? The EU and China were set to meet at a major summit in Leipzig in Germany later in September. Obviously, that has been postponed to later next year. But primarily, one of the things that has been speculated around is that, look, here's the EU giving up essentially on this rather testimonial disinformation report so as not to endanger this larger issue for Europe, which is protecting market access for European firms in China. This is a point that hasn't been made publicly, but some of the speculations that you hear these days is that the EU is really trying to do something which is not that different from what Donald Trump is trying to do in his trade talks with China, which is essentially seek greater protections for investors, seek greater trade terms with China, better safeguards for investors for firms, European firms operating in China from intellectual property theft, which we have known for a number of years is rampant and is sponsored even by the Chinese Communist Party. So I really want to ask you, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that all of those things are highly important for Western economies. We do have to seek fairer trade terms and a fair economic relationship with China. But do you think the EU, the reports that the speculation that we're hearing here, it proves true? Do you think the EU is striking the right balance between what seems like an effort to protect investor access and giving up on this disinformation effort? Because it surely looks like this was a major blunder. The EU has, hastily responded to the scandal. It has even lied about, how this all played out. It is said that it didn't hold out the report and that it wasn't toned down when it so clearly was, as it's been reported. Do you think it was a major mistake by the EU to cave into Chinese pressure? And how do you think, in general terms, how do you think that Western economies, European economies, Britain, the US should be structuring the relationship in terms of these two kind of priorities?
Yeah, hugely important issues you've raised there with regard to the overall relationship between Europe and China. And you mentioned the New York Times report, which came out late last week, which has been actually echoed by several other publications as well. So you've had not only the New York Times, but also you've had Politico, Reuters, Financial Times, Axios, all focusing on this issue of the European Union's report on disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've looked at both the EU's internal report and what the EU has released publicly. Yes, and there is a difference between the two, as the New York Times actually pointed out. And so the New York Times report, in my view, is 100% accurate here, and the EU has denied any kind of wrongdoing here, and the EU has disavowed completely not only what the New York Times is saying, but what multiple other publications have said. And you've had EU officials basically saying this is a complete fabrication. Well, the reality is if you look at the evidence, the European Union did water down its public report with regard to Chinese disinformation. And this followed a series of threats directly from Beijing aimed at the European Commission, basically warning the EU of the implications and the consequences of going forward with this report. And so what you did see here was a case of EU officials within the Commission kowtowing to China, basically bowing down to Beijing in order not to offend the Chinese government. Now, in my view, that's an absolute disgrace. And no European official should be bowing down to Beijing. And I do think this was a sheer act of cowardice on the part of European Union officials. I'm not sure whether European governments had a chance to fully scrutinize the EU reports. It's not clear actually whether European government officials actually had the opportunity to fully sign off. I'm not sure, but it strikes me that there's been a real lack of transparency by the EU with regard to its handling of this report, and also a complete state of denial. I mean, I heard a senior EU official earlier this week saying that all of the reports coming out were just complete nonsense. And the reality is that this is a classic example of where media on both sides of the Atlantic are actually doing their job and holding officials to account. And it is vitally important that European officials represent the reality here, which is that China has implemented a very ruthless, brutal disinformation campaign across Europe. That has to be fully acknowledged and pointed out. And it's very unfortunate the European Union has decided to not reveal the full extent of what is going on, and to backtrack and to kowtow effectively to Beijing. That's unacceptable. And I really hope that national governments across the EU will hold European Union officials to account for what is happening here. And there should be actually, frankly, an investigation within the EU demanded by European governments into what is happening, actually, within the European Commission itself, with regard to reports like this. I mean, EU officials should be accountable to European taxpayers. At the end of the day, most of the time they're not. They don't act in an accountable fashion in any way, and they have to be held to account for what is happening here. And we do need to see, in my view, a full investigation into the EU's handling of this report. We need to know exactly what transpired. But for anyone who's seen the internal EU report, which I have, as opposed to what the EU put out publicly, there is a distinction and a difference there. And the EU has to be held to account. And you mentioned the issue of EU trade with China, and the United States, of course, is in the same facing the same situation, whereby it wants to maintain trade with China, but the United States does not want to allow China to get away with intellectual property theft, does not want to allow the Chinese to get away with heavily protectionist practices. And so the US actually has been holding China to account for its behavior. And the US is also moving forward with the trade agreement with China. So it can be done. You can hold the Chinese fully to account, while at the same time ensuring that trade continues in many sectors, but also ensuring that US intellectual property is protected, and also that US national security is protected as well. And so the US is doing that on the Huawei 5G front. And so this can be done, and I hope that the EU will also adopt the same approach towards China, which is a tough approach, recognizing the importance and huge volume of the EU-China trading relationship, but at the same time holding China to account and never bowing to Beijing, which is what the European Commission has done over the past few days. And we should not see European officials basically bowing to threats and demands from Beijing. And the Chinese should not be setting the agenda in Europe. That's completely unacceptable.
Definitely. Well, that's a really eloquent way of putting it. And just before we engage slightly further here now on the implications of what we've seen the EU do in terms of this report, I just want to call for questions from our audience. We're going to be turning to questions shortly. Dedicating the remaining the last 20 minutes of the hour so that our audience can start building questions to Nile, and we will in due time be conveying those questions. And if I can just ask our audience when they do send us questions, if they could just clarify what their name, where they're based at, or where they're from, and if they have any affiliation that they'd like to disclose to us, and we'll be turning those questions over to Nile in due time. And I think you're drawing a really compelling picture here of the first of all the optics of what we've seen the EU do in terms of the report, the caving in, the bowing, the kowtowing. The optics are certainly catastrophic for the EU, right? I mean, the EU has sought to build a reputation for a while here in terms of fighting disinformation. They've set up this unit within the European External Action Service, which was specifically meant to expose and to unveil disinformation efforts, primarily by Russia at the start, which was the main agent of disinformation. But now that China is picking up the same tactics and even expanding on them, we've seen the EU just embarrass itself and really make a mockery of its claims to be a bulwark for truth and for accurate information. And the optics here, like you mentioned, are certainly very disadvantageous for the EU. But I really like how you drew here some of the implications, what this means for the EU working in concert in terms of facing up to China. Because, like you mentioned, this is certainly not being a transparent process. EU member states, European countries should be highly concerned of how the EU's diplomatic services has acted regards with this report, and they should, when the dust settles from this whole pandemic, we should be hoping that European member states demand an investigation into how exactly this report was addressed. Because, like you said, it's just unconscionable that I believe it was Peter Spano, Neil. I believe Peter Spano is the name of the spokesperson who dared to essentially question the work of the reporters who unveiled this story, and he was out on Twitter for a few days. Lying and denying that there was any toning down whatsoever, and there was, like you've said, and you've seen the internal report, there absolutely has been a marked, significant toning down of the report, and the reporting by the New York Times clearly shows the emails that were traded between foreign ministry officials and EU diplomats. The report was held up by an advisor from the office of Josep Borrell, who is the diplomatic chief, and so the notion that the EU would attempt to cover this thing up, because the toning down is concerning enough. The fact that the EU would try to cover up the toning down would just really dig in and seek to lie about what it did is really concerning. Now it looks like we have no questions as of yet, Nile. We're gonna give our audience maybe a little bit more time here to field questions, and in the meantime, I wanted to go a little deeper, maybe just in terms of how, because it looks to me sometimes, and you've spoken to this in your earlier answers, it seems like some of the countries that are more eager to hold China accountable are Anglosphere countries, primarily the administration of President Trump, but also the UK, as we've increasingly seen with the statements by Dominic Raab. We've seen Australia cut a really tough line. Do you think that these countries, particularly these three, and can you think of any other examples of countries that are really going to lead the way? And what are your hopes in terms of seeing a coalition of the willing, a coalition of countries comprising these three examples coming together to coordinate a response to China's abuses? Do you think that this could become a really coordinated effort?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's significant that a lot of the strongest opposition to China has come from, as you mentioned, the Anglosphere countries. So the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And it's also significant that on the 5G issue, the Australians actually have been very strongly opposed to Huawei. And so the Australians, I think, have taken basically the same position as the United States in terms of rejecting a Huawei role in 5G. But also, if you look further afield, a number of other governments have also been very hard line on the Huawei front. Of course, Japan has. India has actually been very skeptical. Within Europe, the Polish government and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have all been very hard line against China on this particular issue. And so I think that you can build an international global coalition on the 5G issue, and certainly you can expand that further with regard to the big picture on China. But I think it is very significant that, as you pointed out, certainly the lead has been taken by English-speaking countries with regard to standing up to China, and hopefully we will see some of the big players in Europe actually taking a tougher stance. And I have been encouraged by some of the messaging that we've seen in Germany actually over the last few weeks. Very strong opposition to the Chinese disinformation campaign. You've also seen Germany's biggest newspaper taking basically a public position calling for China to be held to account over the pandemic and to pay basically pay money actually to the rest of the world to cover the costs of the fallout of the pandemic, and that of course has led to a furious backlash from Beijing. But I do think that what we're seeing in Germany in particular on the Chinese front is encouraging, and I hope that Chancellor Merkel in her final year in office will work closely together with the United States and the United Kingdom in confronting China. Her handling actually of the German response to the pandemic has been very strong and robust, and I hope she translates that now into real action with regard to China. So yeah, I do think the tide is going to turn against China across the world, but certainly the lead has been taken primarily by the United States. But it's important that the US is able to work with its key European allies in confronting the China threat. And I think that is going to be, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the biggest areas of transatlantic cooperation. We have seen over the last 3 or 4 years a lot of tensions between Europe and the United States on many issues. But I do think with regard to China, there's a great deal of scope for cooperation between the US and key European allies. And I think that without a doubt, the Chinese government is facing a massive public relations disaster. I do think that China's handling of the pandemic has been hugely damaging to China's image across the world, and I think that we have to basically deal with China in the same way that we deal with Russia, as an adversarial power, as a dictatorial power that seeks to undermine at every opportunity the free world, and we have to stand up to that. And this is a moment, certainly, I think, for tremendous transatlantic cooperation, and the transatlantic alliance is hugely important. And at the Heritage Foundation, we have a special report coming out in the next few days, which talks about a a US-European economic recovery partnership that should be put in place in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, talking about ways for the United States and Europe to work together to basically bring about economic regeneration. But it's a regeneration that has to be built upon the principles of free trade, removing protectionism, eliminating tariffs, advancing economic freedom, but also standing up to the enemies of freedom, in particular China, Russia, but also the likes of Iran as well. And we have to be prepared to take whatever action is necessary against those who seek to threaten the free world. And so the US and Europe must work together on so many fronts. But I do think that with regard to standing up to China, we are going to see a lot of positive US and European cooperation in the course of the next few years.
Wonderful. Well, that's really heartening and really encouraging, and I appreciate you mentioning, obviously, the fact that whatever transpired of the EU's behavior in terms of that specific report and what the New York Times uncovered. The reality is that a lot of individual European member states are highly concerned and want to hold China accountable for what it did, regardless of what the EU itself, which is an autonomous supranational body, regardless of how the EU tackles the issue. The reality is that there is a widespread willingness to really hold China accountable, even in Europe. And I appreciate you mentioning the examples of obviously Poland and the Baltic states, and even, like you mentioned, Angela Merkel herself. For all the disagreements that yourself, myself, and many others may have with specific aspects of Angela Merkel's policies, for all the time she's been in office, I think she really deserves credit for being a stern, skilled negotiator. And she, I believe she even mentioned back in the early days of the virus that Europe should be wary of China's politics of generosity, right? The way that China was kind of playing with so-called humanitarian aid, which a lot of times comes with commercial conditions, and many other times, like you've mentioned, the aid just isn't what it looks like. And Angela Merkel herself, who was no one's idea of a foreign policy hawk, but on that specific question, she did cut a rather China-critical line in the early days of the virus. And like you mentioned, we certainly hope that when the dust settles from this, first of all, that the reality of how the EU bowed to Chinese pressure on this report will be revealed, that European member states will hold the EU accountable for that, and that a wider response to China emerges from sovereign, independently acting nation states. And I appreciate you teasing Heritage's upcoming report on a recovery program. It certainly sounds very interesting, and I'm also very interested in how, because obviously, like you said, there's a case to be made that enhanced trade, investment, economic flows will be key to relaunching the global economy in the wake of the recession. Those things are all going to be certainly very important, but we should be very careful with how countries balance that with our relationship with China. We shouldn't be giving up on such important things as, just finding out really what happened, right? The truth of this virus, how it emerged, and China's behavior in helping it spread worldwide. We shouldn't be trading those things for increased trade with China. That's just not how countries should be thinking about the trade-off and the challenges. I want to encourage, again, our audience here to start building questions. Nile has been touching on a number of topics. The 5G issue in the UK, obviously the UK's evolving posture towards China and the wider China relationship with China across the European continent. So I would encourage any and all who are tuned into this webinar to start sending us their questions and telling us also a little bit about themselves, their name, and their affiliation. Now, can I ask you specifically, before we start getting questions, is there a date set for the House of Commons vote, the second vote on the Huawei plan? And how do you assess the parliamentary dynamics here in terms of how much opposition do you think may come not only from the Conservative Party, and you've mentioned a lot of really high-level MPs and key voices within the Tory Party who have been throughout this whole process, who've been really opposed to Huawei's access to the UK. But how do you see the parliamentary dynamics playing out in terms of any other Tory MPs who may be coming out against Huawei in the coming week? Do you think the government is going to stick to its plan? Do you think that Boris himself is going to maybe retract it? And do you think that even MPs from Labour will be coming out against it? How do you think that's going to play out? Is there a specific date for that vote?
Yeah, so there's no date that has been set, and of course the pandemic has created a certain amount of uncertainty in terms of parliamentary votes and so on in the course of the coming months. But I think that most likely a vote will be held sometime in June or July. And my understanding is that there has to be, I think, around 50 or so Conservative MPs to rebel to defeat the legislation. And I think that on the rebel side, they're close to that number already. I expect the opposition parties will vote against the government on this. I think the Labour Party will vote against, and I think all the other opposition parties will probably do the same. And so, I think a realistic prospect here is that in advance of a vote, the government decides to instead announce that Huawei's role in 5G will be sunsetted at a certain point. So that could be at the end of 2022, for example, as a lot of MPs have demanded. And so you could well see the government basically backtracking on this, especially if it senses that a defeat is imminent in the House of Commons. So this is a government with a large parliamentary majority, and so a defeat in the House of Commons would be absolutely extraordinary. And this is probably one of the only issues where the government could be defeated. And so I don't think the Prime Minister will want to see a defeat in the House of Commons. And also, I think that Boris Johnson is listening to all of the concerns within the party and also among the general public as well. And opinion polls have shown that the British public are very nervous about Huawei's involvement in 5G. But if you look at some of the big players in Parliament who are opposed to the Huawei decision, they include, for example, Tom Tugendhat, who is the chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, Tobias Ellwood, who heads the Defence Committee, former cabinet members, Liam Fox, who's a former International Trade Secretary, Owen Paterson, former Environment Secretary. And so you've got some very big heavyweights. And also it's significant that a lot of the leading voices on the backbenches who are voicing concern over Huawei are some of the most influential pro-Brexit voices. So Ian Duncan-Smith, who actually ran Boris Johnson's leadership campaign within Parliament to become leader of the Conservative Party. Ian Duncan-Smith is very close to the Prime Minister, has really been the leading voice on this, and IDS, as he is known, is is one of the most prominent Brexiteers. And so on the Brexit side of the Conservative Party, or among the strongest Brexiteers, you see some of the strongest opponents actually to the Huawei decision, and that of course is going to carry a lot of weight with Boris Johnson. I also understand that there are several members of the cabinet who are uncomfortable with the Huawei decision as well, and so I think that it's definitely the case that many members of the cabinet have concerns over this in addition, and that's going to weigh heavily with the Prime Minister.
Definitely, and those examples are incredibly relevant to the extent they show that there are many concerns obviously that people on both sides of the pond had in the first place about this plan, and you previously mentioned the examples on your side of the pond, how key voices within the Republican caucus on the Senate side of the Capitol, you mentioned Marco Rubio, right? I know Ted Cruz has been very vocal about the Huawei issue in the UK, Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley. These are all leading figures within the Senate, and who've also been incredibly concerned. And I mean, I take it from what you mean that this is the drag that the government's Huawei plan would mean for the special relationship is a key concern for politicians on both sides. And you mentioned a number of examples there in the House of Commons, and I believe that the way that it was perceived, right, in the U.S. When Boris came out with a plan in the first place was really there was a lot of frustration with it. I mean, right, Boris Johnson seemed to care highly about the special relationship. Obviously, his cabinet was very intent on getting Brexit done and delivering on Brexit, and so the whole Huawei plan was very frustrating. We look forward to the government hopefully retracting that, or else the Commons voting against it. I want to encourage our audience one last time to start building questions for Nile. I believe we've touched on a whole number of topics. When they do field questions, if they do, would they please tell us their name, where they're from, their affiliation, and Nile's going to have to attend another commitment in a few minutes, so we won't hold him for too long. If a question does come up in the following minutes, we'll be sure to address it. And now I've heard you a couple of times. I'm really curious about this one specific issue, and I want to make it my last question because I've heard you on a couple of occasions. I believe you were speaking at the National Conservatism Conference back in either Rome or London, one of the two they had, but certainly in Europe. And you mentioned at one point, how would have Margaret Thatcher faced up to this issue? What do you think would her thinking have been at the specific moment in time? How do you think she would have perceived the Chinese threat? How do you think she would have wanted the UK government to address it?
Yes, I think you're referencing comments I made in London, actually, last year. I think that Margaret Thatcher would have handled this crisis with tremendous leadership skill and ability. And I think that she was a politician who was born to lead at a time of crisis. And if you look at the way in which she turned Britain around in the 1980s from, in effect, the sick man of Europe into the strongest economic power in Europe. And so she was somebody who had an instinctive ability to be able to lead at times of great challenge, but she always approached things with a relentlessly optimistic spirit, with a real can-do spirit, and she always handled things by looking firstly at what was in the national interest for the British people. She also drew inspiration greatly from leaders such as Winston Churchill, and she was a huge admirer of Churchill. And during her leadership of the Falklands War, for example, she took great inspiration from how Churchill had led during World War II. And so she had a tremendous sense of history, a tremendous sense of destiny. And if she were the Prime Minister today, I'm in no doubt that she would have handled this crisis with tremendous resolve and determination, but also with a confident and calm spirit, and also with an optimistic approach as well, with a message that the British people will rise to the challenge. They will overcome what is in effect the greatest crisis since World War II. And she would also have a message of economic regeneration based upon free market principles. She was a great believer in economic freedom, in reducing taxes, in reducing red tape, in reducing the heavy hand of big government. And so I think a key priority for her would be, of course, combating the virus, ensuring that the British people could get through the virus in the safest possible manner, but also focusing upon ensuring that Britain would recover in a spectacular fashion based upon the tremendous principles of economic liberty, free trade, that have driven Britain's economic success for centuries. And so she would have always, I think, placed at the heart of her message the emphasis upon the need to protect and defend economic freedom and liberty. And so that would always have been, I think, at the heart of her overall approach, in addition to a real message of resolve, determination, confidence, and strength, drawing inspiration, I think, from the leadership of Winston Churchill. And I think that, Boris Johnson has actually looked closely at Margaret Thatcher's leadership and also Winston Churchill's leadership. And I think that, Boris Johnson has done a superb job so far, and I'm confident that the UK will recover spectacularly in the months and years ahead, and hopefully European countries will, across the European continent, also recover very well.
Definitely, and we really appreciate you, expressing how Lady Thatcher would have faced up to the challenges that this virus has unleashed in such a personal manner. And I know that a lot of people will appreciate hearing that from you, having worked so closely with the Iron Lady. We do have one question now, and I know I want to be mindful of Niall's time. Obviously, he's got another commitment in the next hour, so I want to be mindful of that. Maybe this is just this one's for you to maybe answer very quickly. It could be just a rapid fire round. I wonder if we're going to get any more questions following, but we do have just a few more minutes before we let Niall go. This question comes to us from Habitantis TV, and this person's asking, could the EU have some role in the new US-China scenario? What's your reaction now?
Yeah, and I think the EU, of course, plays a big role because of the huge trading relationship between the European Union and China, which which is close to, I think it's $1 trillion a year or so. And I think that, the sheer weight of trade and investment between the EU and China is very important. And I think that of course also plays a big part in terms of how the United States is approaching the China challenge. And if the US can work together with the European Union in confronting China, especially in terms of confronting some of the negative protectionist trading practices of the Chinese government, I think that would be very helpful. And so I think it's important that the EU works closely together with the United States in terms of confronting illegal practices by China in terms of intellectual property theft, but also confronting Chinese protectionist trading practices. And I think the US and the EU could work closely together on this front. But at the end of the day, though, I'm a believer in the importance really of the role of nation states as opposed to supranational institutions. And while, of course, the EU is very important in this, I think even more importantly, it's important that individual European governments, national leaders, work closely together with the United States in confronting China. So for example, the leaders of Spain, Italy, France, for example, they don't need to wait for the EU to take action. I think the European leaders have to step up to the plate. They have to take a strong stance against China, and they should work closely together with the United States. And I think, at the end of the day, President Trump prefers wherever possible to work closely with European capitals as opposed to going through the European Union. And the EU does have an important role to play on the trade front. But I think that if you really want things to be done effectively, it's best to work through nation states, which is how I think the Trump administration overall approaches Europe on a day-to-day basis. They're far more likely to get constructive results working with individual European leaders as opposed to dealing with the EU bureaucracy. And also, if you look at the overall response to COVID-19, European governments themselves have taken the lead and have been far more effective than the European Union in confronting the crisis. And so, at the end of the day, nation states, national governments that are accountable to European voting publics are far more effective than huge, bloated, unaccountable, unelected bureaucracies. And I think the European Union epitomizes that in terms of its overall structure. There's far too little accountability within the EU. There's far too little democratic accountability within the European Union. And I think if you want to get things done in Europe, you have to really, at the end of the day, operate largely through nation states, as opposed to relying upon, the European Commission to act on your behalf.
Absolutely, and that's a really interesting point, because the way the COVID crisis may, we've got one last question, and this will be maybe just one last chance for Nile to give a brief answer. We want to be mindful of his time, so that he can have plenty of time for his next commitment. But I really appreciate you drawing that the implication of this in terms of COVID being an opportunity for nation states, sovereign nation states, to really step up to the plate, like you said, and really take a leading role. The EU doesn't act like it seems. I mean, certainly what transpired from the whole fiasco around the disinformation report is really concerning. And if we do not see the EU taking a coherent, strong enough line in holding China accountable, then certainly member states should fill that vacuum. And I appreciate you explaining how that could be an opportunity for a stronger transatlantic partnership that could bring a whole number of individual European countries together with the US and other countries around the globe, and bringing them together around a single strategy to tackle China. We've got one last question, like I said, now, and please be as brief and as succinct as you'd like. Hugo Pereira is asking us, do you think the US will continue to pull out of the international landscape and give more room to China's interests? Well, it looks like the question kind of seems to take as a premise, seems to assume that the US's kind of America First approach to foreign policy under the Trump administration is in any way giving China more room on the world stage. And I believe that you and I would agree that is not the case. But how would you respond to this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's also a great question to wrap up the overall discussion, because I think it really is a key question that many in Europe are asking at this time. Are we seeing a US withdrawal from the world, a US retreat from the world? Are we seeing growing US isolationism? And I would argue that we're not, actually. And I've worked in Washington now for about 18 years or so, and I've been here through the course of several different administrations: the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and each administration has had its own different approach. But I'm very confident that with the present administration in place, and I've had a lot of interaction with different parts of the Trump administration, from the White House through to the State Department to the Pentagon. I'm confident that this administration is 100% committed to US leadership on the world stage, and it's also 100% committed to the transatlantic alliance as well. And for example, if you look at the number of US troops on the ground in Europe today, as opposed to 2016, at the end of the Obama administration, there are more US forces on the ground today in Europe than there were a few years ago. And that's a very good thing. You've seen the United States significantly increasing its military presence in Eastern Europe to ward off the Russian threat to the Baltic states and to Poland. You've seen, I think, positive US leadership in terms of confronting Russia and also China as well. The United States is also actively confronting Iran in the Middle East. And I believe that the United States is not in any way retreating from the world. In fact, America's commitment to the defense of the free world, to the transatlantic alliance, to standing with its allies is rock solid. Yeah, there have been a lot of tensions, a lot of disagreements between European countries and the United States over the past few years. There have been a lot of tensions between the US and the EU on many fronts. You look at the issue of climate change, for example. That's a very good example of that. But if you look at the big picture, I do think the transatlantic alliance is actually in very strong shape today. And whenever I travel to Europe, I'm always struck by the fact that the vast majority of European officials, leaders, policy experts, they still believe in the transatlantic alliance. There's no difference in Washington as well. And I think it's absolutely vital that on both sides of the Atlantic, we both continue to invest in the strength and the long-term power of the transatlantic alliance, because at the end of the day, the transatlantic relationship really is the heart of the free world. And when the United States and its European allies work together in confronting the threats to the free world, we have a much safer world. If we work together to confront China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other nations that do not share our values and our principles and our belief in liberty and freedom, we're much stronger when we work together. And I do believe that that's very much the view of the U.S. administration. And I think that it is vital that on both sides of the Atlantic, U.S. and European leaders ensure that the transatlantic alliance continues for many decades, for centuries to come, regardless of who is in power on both sides of the Atlantic. It's vital that administrations on both sides invest in the long-term future of the alliance. And I don't think the United States is retreating from the world, and I do not believe that we will see an isolationist United States emerging in the coming decades. American leadership matters. It's vitally important. I do think that if the United States were to retreat from the world stage, the world would be a far more dangerous place. So let's ensure that American leadership remains strong. Let's also ensure that European governments, European countries stand together with the United States in defending the free world, in advancing economic freedom, in advancing free markets, free trade, and rejecting the siren call of protectionism or big government. Let's defend the freedoms that we have fought so hard over the course of decades, centuries to protect, and let us as the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe as well, let's all work together in ensuring that the free world continues to be free, and that we are at the forefront of advancing liberty and freedom across the world. And thanks very much for hosting me today. It's been a great pleasure, and I wish you all the best in Spain as you continue to confront COVID-19, and I look forward to many more years of close cooperation on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
How about that for a concluding statement? Thank you so much, Nile Gardiner, for sharing your thoughts and being with us here for an hour, taking time out of your busy schedule. So I appreciate you being with us, and thank you so much to our audience. Be sure to check out Nile's great work on his webpage, on his personal page of the Heritage Foundation. Be sure to check out Civismo's social media presence, which is on the bottom of the screen right now. And thank you all so much for joining us for this session. And thank you, Nile.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.